In my last video, I talked about how the ego has a schizophrenic nature. And I'm going to go a little bit further with that here. Because it's very important to grasp this in order to free yourself from the duality consciousness and the ego. So I don't quite remember when I first heard about the concept of the ego. It probably was back in the 1980s. So I have studied this topic for a long time, and I've read books about psychology and spiritual books that talk about ego. And for the first many years that I did this, I was looking to understand the ego. And I was wanting, as we are programmed to do in the Western world, I was wanting to look beyond the surface diversity and confusion and go to deeper layers and say, this is what the ego is. This is what the ego does. And I remember reading books that talk about it like this. The ego is like this clearly defined thing, and therefore you can say this is what the ego is and this is how the ego behaves. But when I started understanding duality, which was back in the early 2000s, and the duality consciousness, I realized that this is actually futile. It's even potentially dangerous. Because since the ego has a dual nature, it's born out of duality, the ego is not one thing. It is by nature at least two. It has a split personality with at least two personalities, in reality more, but two main personalities. So if you think you have defined, this is the ego and this is what it does, then the ego is going to laugh all the way to the bank, because now you're not seeing the other aspect of the ego. And that means you won't be free of ego. So what I came to realize when I started understanding duality is that really it's not possible to define what the ego is, because the ego is like a chameleon. It will change color in order to remain hidden and blend in with the background. And the background is your psychology. So you may define that there are certain things that are clearly self-centered, egotistical, and this is ego-based behavior. And I see many people in the psychological field and in the spiritual field that will single out, killing people is ego-based behavior, cheating people, lying to people, all of these things, this is ego-based behavior. So you can define, here's a list of the bad things that the ego does. And the effect of this is that people think, oh, if I avoid doing those things, then I'm not acting based on ego. But you see, the ego has a schizophrenic nature. So there is a part of the ego that is clearly selfish, self-centered. That's the bad ego. But you see many, many people in the world who think they are good. But they don't realize that their goodness is still ego-based behavior. Because they are being good in order to achieve something. And it may be that they think that being good, God is going to let them into heaven. Or that they are going to gain some recognition and status and admiration among people. So it was a hard lesson for me to learn that, because I'd always, of course, I'm a spiritual person, I see myself as non-violent, I'm not willing to hurt other people and cheat them, I've always had great respect for free will. So it was a hard lesson to learn that I thought I was a good person. And in a sense I was, because I wasn't doing many of these ego-based behaviors. But, as I said in my last talk, the great change I had in 2002 was that I suddenly saw that even what I called the good things, this was still driven by ego. And so basically what you come to is this recognition that you can't really define the ego. You certainly can't define the ego as one thing. So if you were to sort of go beyond all of these expressions of ego. You can say, what's the core of the ego? Well, the core of the ego is partly it wants to survive. We know that there's a certain survival instinct built into our physical bodies. People are very reluctant to accept that they're going to die. They will fight for their last breaths when they're drowning, cling to a straw. And so it has a very deep survival instinct. And we can see ourselves as very peaceful people, but if we are in an extreme situation where somebody's trying to kill us, and it seems the only way that we can survive is to kill the other person, it's him or me, then many people will kill the other person if they can in order to survive. That's just a survival instinct. I'm not here talking about whether this is good or bad. And what I'm saying is this is not ego. This is just a survival instinct built into the body. But what you have to realize is that the ego also has a survival instinct. Once the ego is born, it wants to survive. And it will do anything to survive. And that's why I'm saying, if you identify that the ego is what makes you self-centered and selfish, and here is a list of behaviors that are egotistical, and if you avoid those behaviors, you don't have an ego, then the ego is simply going to morph into this, oh, good ego. I'm such a good Christian. I'm such a good spiritual person because I don't do any of these bad things that other people do. But that's still ego. And you are just as trapped in your ego as the people who are trapped in the selfishness. And so this is simply the survival instinct of the ego, and it will use the duality consciousness to do two things: hide from you and control you, manipulate you. So you could say that if there is a unifying element of the ego, it is that it wants to survive. Because once it has been created, again, let's just step back here. What I have said in previous talks is, the ego did not create itself. This is very, very important to understand. And it took me a while to grasp this. I mean, it's not really a simple point to get. Because I remember when I first heard about ego, I thought, oh, it's some kind of alien element in my psychology that I need to avoid and overcome. But I couldn't really pinpoint what the ego is, so how did it come into being? It was almost like I felt that it was something that was just forced upon me. That somehow some outside force forced this ego upon me. And therefore, what could I do about it? But you see, the essential realization that we have to come to in order to free ourselves from the ego is, where did the ego come from? Who created the ego? Oh yes, I created my ego. My conscious you, the core of my lower being, made a decision to go into separation. And that decision created the ego. And the ego was born out of duality, so the ego was born with a split personality, but it still has this unifying element it wants to survive. And the important thing here is, the ego didn't create itself. It's pretty much like a computer, right? The computer did not create itself. It did not program itself, which means the computer doesn't have self-awareness. This applies to artificial intelligence as well. The computer does not have self-awareness. The computer cannot, like for example, I have a computer on my desk here that's an Apple computer. It has an operating system in it, the Apple operating system. Now you might have a Windows PC where the operating system is Windows. It's programmed. Yours is programmed by Microsoft, mine is programmed by Apple. And my Apple computer does not have the ability to step back and say, oh gosh, yeah, this Apple operating system is pretty, but I want to do all the things you can only do in Windows. I'm going to change myself into a Windows system. This can't be done, right? The computer cannot do this. It's the same thing with the ego. Once the ego is created, the ego does not have self-awareness. It doesn't have the ability to step back and say, oh, I don't really want to be a separate being. I'm going to cancel myself out so I don't exist anymore. And then Kim is free to live without me. The ego cannot do this. The ego was created by the conscious you making a decision. The only way that you are ever going to be free of your ego is that your conscious you, who you are, must make a decision. Now here's the trick. When you made the decision to create the ego, to go into separation, you were not fully conscious of what you were doing and what the consequences were. You had been given some teachings by your spiritual teachers that you were connected to at the time that warned you about the risks of experimenting with duality. But you weren't really paying attention to it. And we weren't paying attention to it. I'm including myself in it. So we didn't make a fully conscious decision to go into separation. It was just kind of like, oh, let's just see what it's like, you know. Let's just try it out. How bad can it be? But in order to get out of duality and separation, we have to make a conscious decision based on the experiences we have now had with duality. You see, as I've said, there isn't really anything wrong with going into duality. It's an aspect of what you can do with free will. But the problem is that duality becomes a self-validating, self-reinforcing state of mind. And until you make a fully conscious decision, you can't get out of it. Of course, you could say the saving grace there is that when you go into duality, you have experiences in duality. So that means that after you have been in duality for a while, you can now make a conscious decision to go out of it because you have more awareness of duality than you had before you decided to go into it. You see what I'm saying? You're standing there, should I go into duality or not? And you don't have the experience with what it's like to be in duality. You don't really have the full awareness of the consequences. But after you have been in duality and experienced what it's like, now you have the experience. So now you can make a more conscious decision to go out of it again. But it requires you to make a conscious decision. And here is why duality, the duality consciousness, becomes a catch-22. Because, let's look at it this way again. The conscious you was born as a connected being. As I've said, we start out with a very rudimentary, localized, point-like sense of self. But you still have a sense there's something, excuse me, there's something outside my own mind that I'm connected to, namely your higher self and your spiritual teachers. So you're not alone. And you can say that in the beginning, as a self-aware being, you have very limited experience with life, and you have very limited experience with your environment and with making choices and experience the consequences. But you see, when you're a new being, you don't really have the option to go into duality, because you don't even understand what it is. So only after you have existed for a certain time do you become aware that there is actually an alternative to seeing yourself as a connected being, and that is to see yourself as a separate being. So only then can you formulate this curiosity, oh, what's it like? Right? So the thing is, when you make that decision to go into duality, the conscious you has some experience, it has some sense of who it is, but it also has this sense of being connected. The moment you go into duality, or separation, you are losing that connection. And the conscious you is going to feel it as a loss. As I've said in a previous video, the sense of self you have as a connected being actually dies, and you are reborn as a separate self, with a separate sense of self. It's not that the conscious you changes. It's just that, okay, so let me explain this a little more carefully. The conscious you, in its essence, is just this neutral, pure awareness. But in order to relate to the world and descend into a physical body on a planet like Earth, you have to, as I said, create structures in your mind, the identity mind, the mental mind, the emotional mind, and even the physical, so you can integrate with the physical body and operate a physical body. And that creates a sense of self. So you have a sense of self that is relating to this world. But you're also sensing that you are connected to something beyond the material world, beyond the physical world, beyond your body and your outer mind. But what I'm saying is, you have a sense of self when you make that decision to go into separation. And that sense of self is not the conscious you, it's something you've created in your identity body. The highest level of your identity body is your sense of self relating to the world. And also the sense of self as a connected being. You can look at it as a subconscious self that I've talked about. And so, but it's not a dualistic self. It's just a sense of self you created in order to integrate with the four lower bodies. So that sense of self dies when you go into duality. And a new subconscious self is now born that sees itself as a separate being. And you can say that that new self is the essence of the ego. Because it is, by very nature, it sees itself as a separate being. The big question now is, how does the conscious you react to this? The conscious you really now has it still has two choices. Right? The choice is, will I go into this separate self, integrate with it, identify myself as this self and see myself as a separate being? Or will I step outside the self I created and just be neutral awareness and look at this self and say, oh, this isn't me? But you see, in the beginning, when we first made that decision to go into separation, the conscious you did not step outside. The conscious you went into the self. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. You had a desire to experience what it was like to be a separate being. How do you experience you are a separate being? The conscious you must go into this self, the separate self, and identify itself as that self. I'm a separate being. That's how you see yourself. But what I'm trying to get to here is the realization that once the conscious you has created this separate self, this ego, it still has a sense of loss. It's lost something, but it doesn't know what it has lost. It isn't aware of it. It could become aware of it by stepping outside the separate self, seeing itself as pure awareness, and again sensing it's connected to something. But we didn't do that as I just said, because we wanted that experience of being a separate being, right? You can't be a connected being and a separate being at the same time. It's either or. Now, this means what? Well, this means that the ego is created to basically validate your decision to go into separation. And that means that the primary task of the ego, the first task of the ego, is cover over this sense of loss. Compensate for the sense of loss. Divert your attention from the sense of loss. And that means, as I've explained, that the ego thinks that it can attain some ultimate status, it can attain immortality, it can attain salvation, it can get into heaven by qualifying, by doing something in this world, by achieving something in this world, in the material world, which is separate from the spiritual realm. The ego can become immortal. And it needs to do this because then the conscious you can say, oh, but it wasn't really, well, the conscious you can't really say this, but the feeling is, I'm okay. I'll be saved in the end. Everything will work out in the end. Even though I've lost something, it'll be okay because I will eventually be saved. If I'm a good Christian, I'll go to heaven after this lifetime. And so this is the basic task of the ego. But what is it that maintains the ego's existence? It is that the conscious you is identified with the ego as a separate being, and the conscious you does not use its ability to step outside the separate self and see that it's just a self, it's not who I am. I'm really a spiritual being, I can't be defined by anything in this world. So this means that when the conscious you isn't doing that, and as I said, it doesn't do that because it wants to experience what is a separate being, but I'm just trying to point out here. What that essentially means is that the conscious you is not being conscious. It's just being a you. It's not being conscious of who it is, that it's not the outer personality, that it isn't created in this world, that it isn't defined by anything in this world, that it's actually a spiritual being that's an extension of your higher self. It's not being conscious of that. And that means that the conscious you is not using its most essential ability to be self-aware, to look at itself from the outside, or rather, to look at its outer personality from the outside and say, is this really who I want to be? So you see what I'm trying to say here is that you could say that the conscious you has complete free will. It can have any experience it wants, but it has experiences through the selves, the subconscious selves. Even as a connected being in the physical body, you are having these experiences through the selves you created in order to descend to a certain level. As a separate being, you have experiences through the separate selves you create after you go into separation. But the conscious you is always more than this. And you could say that the essence of the conscious you is to have an experience as long as it wants. Again, you're allowed to go into separation. And as long as you want to have that experience, it's okay. But how do you get out of that experience again? By the conscious you again becoming aware of its ability to be self-aware, step outside the outer self and say, have I had enough of separation? Do I want more than this? Or even in the school of hard knocks, come to the point and say, I can't do this anymore. There must be an alternative to this. And you reach for help. So you see what I'm saying? It's like the essential responsibility of the conscious you is to be self-aware and to make the choice. Who do I want to be in relation to this world? And that's the sole responsibility of the conscious you. But when you go into separation, when the conscious you identifies itself with and as a separate self, the conscious you puts aside that responsibility. And what does that mean? It means that the conscious you now gives responsibility for its life to the ego. And this is a very subtle and really important point to get. It took me, again, a long time to get this. Because as I said, I started seeing the ego as it's some alien thing in my psychology that was somehow forced upon me and that's seeking to control me. It's like this bad thing that's hiding and seeking to control me. And it's not invalid because the ego has created this, out of the ego has created all this conglomerate of these subconscious selves that are seeking to control us. But the thing is, the ego was actually not created to control us. The ego was created, not consciously mind you, but the ego was created to take upon itself responsibility for my experience in this world. The conscious you, basically, you have the fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty. right? There's the girl that grows up in a castle, and then she pricks her finger, and there's a curse that makes her fall asleep, right? That's the conscious you after it creates the ego. It basically puts itself asleep and says, I'm not responsible for making conscious choices anymore. I'm letting the ego make choices for my life. So you see what I'm saying? The ego is not an alien thing that was forced upon you. It's not even an evil thing. The conscious you created the ego to do something for it. And you could say, well, what is the ego created to do? To give you the experience you're a separate being, and that you can do whatever you can do as a separate being, and get away with it. But really, the ego is created to justify that you put your self-awareness and your responsibility for making conscious choices to sleep while you're having the experience as a separate being. That's what the ego is created as. And that's a tough thing to get. And the only way to really get it is, well, first of all, you need to have certain teachings. But you also, I think the only way to really get this is that you have to have the experience that the conscious you steps outside of your outer personality, outside of the ego. And you again return to this, your neutral awareness, so you're just looking at yourself, you're looking at your personality, your psychology, you're looking at your ego, and you're seeing, oh, I am not the ego. The ego is just something I created and took on. And then you can connect to either the one mind, the Christ mind, or your higher self, or your spiritual teachers, and realize you're not defined in this world. You came out of the spiritual realm as a spiritual being who cannot be defined by anything in this world. You can realize basically that the conscious you hasn't been changed by creating the ego, but the conscious you has put itself to sleep. And that means, and why is it important to realize this? Because, as I said, if the ego was something that was forced upon you, what could you do about it? How could you get free of it? It's a totally disempowering view. And I realized that for 20 years or so, I had a disempowering view of the ego. And the only way to empower yourself is to realize this. I created the ego, which means what? I can uncreate the ego. In fact, you're the only one who created your ego, you're the only one who can uncreate it. And this can then help you start gradually, because it usually doesn't happen in one big thing because it's too much for us to take on. But gradually you can start taking responsibility for yourself. You can realize, well, declaring Jesus Christ to be my Lord and Savior isn't going to guarantee that I'll be saved after this lifetime. Because the only way I can be saved is that I ascend to the spiritual realm. And that means giving up the ego and letting it die. And God is not going to do that for me. The Ascended Masters are not going to do that for me. The Great Pumpkin Man isn't going to do it for me. Santa Claus isn't going to do it for me. Only the conscious you who created the ego can uncreate the ego. But in order to do that, I have to consciously see. Usually you first see these subconscious selves and undo them. And then you come to a point where you see the ego, the core of the ego. And this is a subtle process that will take time. I don't think anybody does this in one awakening experience. I simply don't believe so. As I said, maybe you could have started the process in a past lifetime so you can do it more quickly in this lifetime. But still, I would still say that it takes a process to actually see what I'm talking about here, the essence of the ego. That sense that you are a separate being, and to see that you created it. And so once you begin to understand this, and if it's new to you, then I realize it will take some time for you to process this. But once you begin to grasp this, you gain a whole new perspective on dealing with the ego. Because, to return to what I started with, you can realize that the ego is born out of duality. There's no consistency in the ego. The ego has its main drive to survive. And the ego isn't self-aware, but it does realize that you're its creator. It also realizes that it can only survive because you don't see it. You don't understand what the ego is and what it does, how it affects you, how it affects your perception, the way you look at life. You don't grasp that. So the ego will do anything to stay hidden from you. It will survive, it wants to survive, and it sees that it can only survive by staying hidden. But this also puts the ego in an existential dilemma because, as I said, it's born out of duality, so it has a split personality. Because as part of the survival instinct of the ego, it also has this drive to become immortal by building its status in this world. And what does that mean? Well, it can mean many different things, but it can mean, for example, being a good Christian, living up to all the outer demands of a specific, like say the Catholic religion. Or being a good spiritual person, living up to all the demands of your guru, your spiritual movement, this and that. And the ego can even develop a drive to reach some ultimate status, almost like a godlike status in this world where it knows everything, is always right, it can never be proven wrong. So you see, this is you can say, again, the ego is born out of separation. It has this basic survival instinct. But it has the split personality right there, where it on one hand realizes it has to stay hidden from you, but on the other hand, it has to increase its status in the world so it can chase this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow called immortality. And these two are, of course, contradictory. In a sense, potentially contradictory, because the ego has to make itself stand out. I am so special, I am superior. But on the other hand, it has to stay hidden from you, which it can do as long as you are identified with the ego. Because the ego says, I am superior, but you are thinking, I am superior. And why is that? Because what did the ego start with? You desire to experience a separation. And one of the main things you can experience as a separate being is you can compare yourself to others. When you're connected, there's no meaning in comparing yourself to others, really. But when you're separate, you can compare yourself to others and you can say, am I inferior to other people or am I superior to other people? And here's the trick. You may think that the ego only wants to experience being superior. But you see, in duality, you always have the two opposite polarities. And you can say, yes, I want to experience what it's like to be superior. That's fine. So in one lifetime, for example, you can experience you're superior. But you cannot go into duality and only experience one side of duality and not the other. So therefore, you will have some lifetimes where you are inferior. In one lifetime, you might be a king or a nobleman. In the next, you might be a peasant. You cannot have half a dualistic experience. You must experience both dualistic polarities in order to have the full experience of duality. And that's what you wanted. And so, what that means is that the ego has both aspects. It has the fear of being inferior. In other words, the ego thinks that it's like the Old Testament God, the angry and judgmental God up there in the sky, who's looking at everything and evaluating. So you're coming up there and he goes down or up. And the ego is based on this duality. It fears that it could be found not worthy to be immortal, and it hopes to be found worthy. So it's always ping-ponging between the two. And you can see some of the people who feel very superior to others, they're very afraid of making a mistake, so they would suddenly be plunged from the superior status to the inferior status and be no good. It's all or nothing, black and white. So what I'm saying here is that the ego, it always has these two polarities. You cannot escape it. The ego cannot escape it. It can never come to a point where it is feeling completely superior, because it always in the back of its mind has this risk of being found inferior. But it is always chasing that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that one day it will find some magical, mystical way to be completely superior. And it's never going to happen. And that's why there's so much suffering, because the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, first noble truth, life is suffering, or there is suffering. And why is there suffering? Because the ego can only suffer, because it's always split between these two extremes. Inferior, superior. And the tension between the two, where you're constantly seeking to avoid the inferior and achieve the superior, which can never be achieved because of duality. You see what I have said all along? The two dualistic polarities are born at the same time in relation to each other. One cannot exist without the other. You can never achieve such an absolute sense of superiority that there's no risk of inferiority. Why? Because what's superiority? It's superiority compared to what is inferior. You can never avoid the pairing that the Buddha talked about. So it's the ego, of course, can never see this. It can never see it. But the conscious you can come to see it. And that's when you really start freeing yourself from it. But how can you come to see it? Only by reactivating your willingness to become self-aware, to step outside of your four lower bodies, look at your personality, look at your psychology, look at, for example, a reactionary pattern, and say, why do I get angry when things don't go my way? And then you take responsibility for making the decision, I don't want to be this way. And then you identify, it's actually a subconscious self in your four lower bodies that makes you react this way and make you think this is the only way to react. And when you separate yourself from it, look at the illusion behind the self, you can let the self die. That's when you're taking responsibility. Now, doing that to oneself isn't going to really touch the ego. It's going to touch the core of the ego. But as I'm saying, when you begin to grasp this process, when you begin to apply it, when you begin to experience that it does work, you can make progress. And I would say, I'm using specific words here, subconscious self and this and that, and the conscious you. But most spiritual people I've met, even though they didn't have the vocabulary I'm using, they've engaged in this process more or less consciously, we can say. So most spiritual people have already made some progress on this. It's just a matter of really becoming more consciously aware of the process and applying it more consciously. But what I'm getting at here is that ultimately, when you go to the core of the ego, right, the core of the ego will never feel responsible for anything. It's only the conscious you that can feel responsible. Why? Because the conscious you is the one who has self-awareness and free will. The ego has neither self-awareness nor free will. Now you may say, but aren't you saying that the conscious you gave responsibility for your life to the ego? So doesn't that mean the ego is making choices? Yes, the ego is making choices. Or rather, it's making selections. Let's look at it this way. Talked about this before. One dualistic polarity, another dualistic polarity. There's a scale in between. Now the ego can go into what I call black and white thinking, and it can think, this is ultimately right, this is ultimately wrong, I choose what's ultimately right, I'll survive, I'll get into heaven. This is black and white thinking of the ego. But so you may say the ego is choosing what's ultimately right, but is it? No. It's making a selection between two polarities that are defined by the ego, or rather the duality consciousness that the ego is born out of. Now another way of thinking of the ego is what I call gray thinking, where instead of focusing on the extremes, it's focusing on the gradations in between. And it might say, well, if I'm striving to always be a certain way or be neutral or or not have strong opinions, or if I'm saying like an agnostic that we can't really know what's true and false, then I'm okay. So the ego can also think this way. It doesn't have to think black and white. But what is the ego doing in gray thinking? Is still making a selection between the gradations between the two dualistic extremes. So the ego is born out of the scale of duality, and it can the only options that the ego can see are on the scale of duality. So that's why I'm saying it isn't really choosing, it's selecting which one of these predefined values am I going to do, am I going to select. The conscious you has the potential to make choices, because the conscious you can actually come to the awareness. I am not this scale, I'm not the ego. So what is the conscious you? I'm neutral awareness, meaning in this illustration, I'm the white paper. And the scale is just drawn upon the white paper. But the paper hasn't become the scale. I haven't become the outer personality. And that's why instead of allowing my ego to select one point on the scale, I, the conscious you, can choose to go beyond the scale, to look beyond the scale. And that's what I mean with when I talk about the Christ mind, the one mind, the Buddha nature. You are selecting. There is a way to respond to life that isn't defined by and on this dualistic scale. So we can say duality, the duality consciousness, defines. Here is a scale with two polarities and gradations in between. This is the only way to look at life. The only options you have are found on this scale. There's nothing outside of it. Now, of course, the duality consciousness has defined many different scales. Christianity, Islam, capitalism, communism, scientific materialism, this or that. But what is always projected is still within duality and within what the duality consciousness can define. Those are the only choices you have. But as I said, this is just making selections. But the conscious you has the potential to step outside of your outer personality, reconnect to pure awareness, which really is the one mind that shows that everything is connected, that nothing is separate, because in duality everything is separate. That's why there's two polarities. And so you can connect, the conscious you can connect to that and say, I'm not going to select one of these dualistically defined polarities. I'm going to choose the one mind, the Christ mind. I want to go beyond duality. And when you make that choice, you will receive help from the Ascended Masters who have embodied the Christ consciousness and represent it for Earth, and from your higher self. But in order to get to that point where you can even hear this help, you have to separate yourself enough from the ego that you realize you're not the ego, and you have to be willing to take responsibility. I am the one who's making choices in my life. Otherwise, you will still be trapped in the ego, and you will make the selections that the ego can define. And just to give you one example of this, I know I've said this before in other videos, but you look at humankind. You have a small group of people, you can call them a power elite, that are seeking to gain power, influence, and they see themselves as superior. I have in my video about how the world was created, I talk about there are certain beings that are called fallen beings who have taken the ego survival instinct to the extreme, where they think they have elevated their egos, their separate selves, to a godlike status. They are absolutely right, and therefore they must become immortal, they must be saved. And so this is the one extreme of the ego. You are raising the separate self up to some ultimate status, however you see it. The opposite extreme that you see in a lot of people on Earth is that you absolutely don't want to take responsibility for anything. You don't want to seek to be superior, you just want to be inferior. Because if you see yourself as superior, you're taking a risk. You could be proven wrong. Other people could be more superior than you. That's why you often see these people who have sense of superiority and often competing with each other or warring with each other, because they all want to be the one that's at top of the food chain. So you're taking a risk there, and you could be proven wrong. But if you abandon all responsibility, you go into a state of superiority or inferiority. You say, oh, I can't know what's real and unreal on my own. I just have to follow this outer religion or this guru or this. So you're not wanting to make choices. You're wanting other people to tell you what to do. And that's the opposite dualistic polarity on the scale. But there's a third option here. And that's what you see in some of these non-dual teachers. They have, probably for many lifetimes, they have attempted to raise their separate self to some ultimate status. And they may have come to genuinely see the futility of this. And they have also seen the futility of the inferiority. They don't want to go into that either. But they haven't fully taken responsibility for making their own choices. And therefore they go into this third option that could be said to be the midpoint on the scale, which is that you are saying the separate self is what causes people to suffer. But the separate self is unreal. And therefore, in order to escape suffering, we need to strive to have no self. Because if I have no self, I can't suffer. But you see, if you go into the extreme that you are letting the ego run its quest for superiority, you are allowing the ego to make decisions for you. If you go into the other extreme of inferiority, where say you don't want to make any decisions, you are allowing the ego to make decisions for you. And if you go into the midpoint, because it's still on the scale, where you say, oh, the separate self is unreal, I need to strive to have no self, you are still allowing the ego to make decisions for you. Why? Because you are denying that you are more than the separate self. You are saying, oh, my entire personality, my individual viewpoint on life, this is just a separate self. Because there is only the separate self and infinite undifferentiated awareness. There's only the separate self or no self. And when you see yourself as a no self, you are not taking responsibility that I am the one who created the ego and I am the only one who can uncreate it. You think you found some kind of magic trick. You can undo the ego by declaring it doesn't exist anymore. But what is the essence of the ego? The essence of the ego is it uses the duality consciousness. I've said this before in other videos. When you are a connected being, you are connecting to something that is real, outside your own mind. Your higher self, the spiritual realm, the ascended masters, they are not defined inside your own mind or in the collective mind of humankind. They are not defined by anything on earth. It's a reality that you're connected to when you're connected. When you go into separation, you disconnect from the reality. And that means you are now seeing everything through the duality consciousness. And in duality, both polarities and the midpoint, the whole scale in between, is unreal. It's all an illusion. All you see is an illusion. But more than that, what is it you see? You see what the ego has defined, or what the egos of other beings, the collective consciousness of humankind, the fallen beings, over time have defined as real. The Old Testament God is just a definition by human beings that have created this God in the sky. That is completely unreal. It has nothing to do with the real God and with the spiritual realm. But if you step even further back, what's the experience that the ego is having? Ego is having the experience. It can define reality. It can define what's real and unreal. I am like a god. I can define what's real and unreal. This is what the ego thinks. Well, maybe not consciously, but it feels like that. And so you see what these non-dual teachers are doing? They're seeing, yeah, I don't want to pursue this, elevating the separate self to a superior status. But I don't want to go into either feeling inferior, because I'm not good. But there is a trick in between. We define the ego out of its existence. We define that the ego is just a separate self, and it doesn't really exist. So we don't have to deal with it. We just have to awaken from the dream and see that it's all an illusion. Then we are free of the illusion. But they are still saying, they're still allowing their egos to define what's real and unreal, instead of taking the responsibility of the conscious you to discover what's real and unreal. And how do you discover what's real? By looking beyond your own mind. And how do you look beyond your own mind? Only by connecting to the one mind, the Christ mind, that's beyond your own mind, beyond anything that can be defined on earth. And how do you connect to that mind? By seeing that this isn't some universal mind that's undifferentiated, like Brahman or the Atman, where there's no differentiation. No, the Christ mind, the one mind, is represented to earth by beings who have become one with that mind, who have overcome the ego and the sense of separation. And those are what I call ascended masters. Call them something else if you want, I don't care. The only thing that matters is you're connecting to these beings who are in the spiritual realm. And they can give you a frame of reference so that the conscious you can evaluate what's real, because you're experiencing there's something that's real. It's more real than what's defined by your ego in your follower bodies and by the duality consciousness of humankind. What you experience when the conscious you steps outside the follower bodies is more real than what you experience when the conscious you is inside the follower bodies. Only when you have that frame of reference can you really begin to question the many, many illusions of the ego. But that requires that you take responsibility for making choices. And when you say, I don't exist as a self, you are still abandoning that responsibility. You haven't taken that responsibility. You're still thinking there's a magic trick. Oh, you can just awaken from the dream. Now again, as I've said before, I understand there are people out there who are absolutely convinced that they have no self, they have awakened, they are enlightened, and this is fine. What have I said? The universe, planet Earth, is an experience machine. You can have any experience you can imagine. If you want to have the experience that you are no self, you don't exist, there's no one here talking is just happening, you're allowed to have that experience. But it's still an experience created in your own mind. And that's fine. Again, when you go into separation, you're basically saying, I want to experience what it is like when my mind creates my experience. And you are allowed to go into separation. You are allowed to have that experience for as long as you want. All I'm saying is, I came to a point where I realized this and I'd had enough of it. If you haven't come to that point, that's okay. You continue having whatever experience you're having. I totally respect your free will. I'm only giving these teachings for those people who have come to the same point I've come to. And I'm hoping that by hearing about my experiences and the process I've gone through, you can go through your process faster and more easily. That's my only motivation here. I'm not trying to prove that these people are wrong for experiencing that they have no self. But I am saying that in my experience, they're just having an experience created in their own minds. They are not connected to any reality outside their own minds. And so the real conclusion I wanted to get to here is this, that the ego has this split personality. And you can say, when it comes to taking responsibility, you can say, in essence, the ego can never really take responsibility because it can only make selections on the dualistic scale. It can't choose to go beyond the scale because it can't see beyond the scale. It can't even see it as a possibility. And that means that I talked about the two groups, right? So you have the one group that is seeking superiority and the other group that's seeking inferiority. Those who are in the inferiority polarity, they are basically abandoning all responsibility. I'm not responsible for anything. They are projecting outside themselves. I'm no good, I can't do anything, I can't know anything. Just leave me alone. I just want to dig myself into a little hole and not be seen. So they think that if they abandon all responsibility, they can't be wrong. Then you have the superiority group. And they are schizophrenic when it comes to responsibility. Because when something goes well for them, the ego will take responsibility. Oh, I did it. I am the greatest. But when something goes wrong, they will abandon responsibility and they will project, oh, this was something outside. This was other people, or some other forces, or a hand of God, or whatever. That's why I failed. I didn't actually fail. It was just these outer things made it impossible. But I did something good. It wasn't the outer things that made it possible. I did it. So that's again the schizophrenic nature of the ego. It ping-pongs back and forth. And that's why you can't really say the ego never wants to take responsibility. In a sense, the ego never wants to take responsibility for making a real choice, because the ego can't. It can't see beyond duality. But in duality, the ego is still not, it's not consistent that it's either not taking responsibility or always taking responsibility. Because you can see that even the people who are in the inferiority group, they can become followers of a person in the superiority group, so that they now say, oh, this leader is going to solve all our problems. And if I follow that leader, I'm suddenly superior to those who are not supporting, who are not following this leader. You saw that dynamic in the 1930s in Germany with Hitler. You see it today in the United States. You've seen it, and you see it in other countries today as well. Those who are inferior can come to feel that by supporting this leader who is really superior, they themselves become superior to others who are not supporting that leader, who are not following that leader. So again, even those in the inferiority, even though they have abandoned all responsibility, they can still ping-pong back and forth, take responsibility for some things and not for others. And the reason why it's important to realize this is that it's again another thing where you can look at yourself and say, do I have this cognitive dissonance? Do I have certain reactions, certain beliefs that are schizophrenic, that are contradictory, that are not consistent? And that means you can now expose, there's a pair of subconscious selves here that are opposing each other. It makes it easier for you to see these selves. So again, the process of being free of ego is you have to remove a certain number of subconscious selves before you can start seeing the ego as a separate being. Because the subconscious self is focused on specific things. So you can see people in the world who are, I'd say, a person is completely focused on his or her career. Or another person is completely focused on making money. And a third person is angry all the time. Always opposing somebody. It's always somebody who is opposing them. So you can see that there are people whose attention is completely pulled outwards, projecting out there. And even spiritual people can be deceived by their egos to think that there's an outer path you can follow. You follow the teacher, you study the teachings, you practice the spiritual practices, and one day you're automatically going to awaken. There's no automatic awakening. You're only going to awaken when you, the conscious you, starts looking at itself and starts looking at your psychology and personality and making real choices. So what I'm saying is the start of the spiritual path, the real spiritual path, the inner path, is when you become willing to look at yourself. And you basically gradually take responsibility for realizing that whatever goes on in your mind is something that you ultimately chose. But many of the specifics you didn't actually choose. The ego selected them for you. What I've said before is, duality separation is like a maze, right? So you're standing there, the conscious you is standing there outside the maze. It's not just a conscious you. You have your four lower bodies you've already created in order to take embodiment. So you're standing outside the maze. You're thinking, oh, what's it like in there? And then you make the choice to go in. And immediately you come upon a split in the path. You can take two directions. And you are not choosing which one to take. The ego that you created in order to go into the maze is making a selection. That one or that one. Then it's like I said, you choose. Christianity is the ultimate religion. That will give me a sense of superiority. So you walk down that side, that road. But then you come to another split, because now there's a threat. What is Christianity is wrong. So in order to deal with that, you have to choose. Again, the ego selects this one or that one. That creates another subconscious self. And then so what I'm saying is, once you go into duality, you're reacting to conditions in this world. Other people, or what's happening in the world, you are reacting. And for each time there's a situation that forces you to react, the ego is making a selection between two options that are both defined by duality. And maybe there's more than two in certain situations, but they're all defined on the dualistic scale. That's all the ego can see. So you have all of these subconscious selves that are created out of an illusion, a dualistic illusion. It's an illusion defined by duality. So you can say, you, the conscious you, did not consciously create all of these subconscious selves. The ego created them. And you can say, as the non-dual teachers are saying, oh, this is all just part of the separate self, and it's all unreal. Yes, it is all unreal ultimately. But is it there in your four lower bodies? Take your physical body, right? If I hurt myself, does it hurt? Could I feel it? Yeah. So I can say, well, my physical body isn't ultimately real. No. But the pain still affected me in the now. So you can say, well, all this separate self is not real. Yeah, but you're still carrying it with you in your four lower bodies. It's affecting you all the time, because it's a perception filter that colors how you look at life and yourself. So it has a temporary reality. And as I said, the purpose of this, which is what non-dual teachers ignore, is your growth in consciousness. You grow by exercising your free will, and one option you can do with free will, go into separation. But the conscious you, as I said, puts itself to sleep when you go into separation. It allows the ego to make selections. You're not learning from the ego's selections, because you're not conscious of it. So how are you going to learn from going into duality? Oh yeah. When you consciously choose, I can't do this anymore, I don't want to do this anymore, I want something higher, you turn around. Now you can start retracing your steps in the maze. And for each time you come to a fork and you see that there's a separate self that was created there, and the separate self was based on a dualistic illusion. You, the conscious you consciously see the dualistic illusion, and you choose to reach for the one mind rather than the dualistic divided mind. Then you grow. That's how you grow from going into separation. You basically don't grow from going into separation, you grow from consciously going out of it again. If you don't grasp this, you are left with this, which you find in Eastern teachings going thousands of years back. Life really has no purpose. Your existence has no purpose. The purpose of your existence is to awaken from the illusion, the Maya, and achieve non-existence. And realize you don't exist. What's the you that can realize you don't exist? It's not the ego. It's only the conscious you. And the conscious you will not, when it becomes aware of itself, will not realize it doesn't exist. It will realize, I am not the separate self, but I am a real self. I am an extension of my spiritual self. And I'm a real being because my self-awareness is an extension of the Creator's being. And my purpose is to expand my sense of self until I achieve the Creator consciousness. That is my purpose in life. It's not my purpose in life to come into being in this world, suffer for millions of incarnations, and then pop, I'm back into Brahman, Atman, the infinite awareness, undifferentiated. That's not the purpose. The conscious you is real in the sense that it's an extension of your I Am Presence, which is real in the sense that it's an extension of ascended masters, which are real because they're an extension of the Creator. That's reality. That isn't defined by your mind or by the minds of the fallen beings or human beings or anybody else. It's reality. You can connect to it. That's what all of my videos are designed to help you do. Or you can continue to deny it because you want to continue having the experience that you are a separate being. Either way, it's fine with me. Really, it is fine with me. Because I know my experience. I'm not affected by your choices. I'm only affected by my own choices.